Police in California have arrested a high school teacher accused of having sex with a student. I'm going to be speaking with a former prosecutor and civil sexual abuse attorney about the investigation and potential punishment. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. 33-year-old Dulce Flores is facing a sex crimes charge after authorities say she had sexual contact with one of the students at the California high school where she was teaching. Now, the city of Riverbank is north of Modesto in Stanislaus County, and the sheriff's office there says that Riverbank High School officials had alerted them that there were allegations from a third party of this inappropriate relationship between a Spanish teacher and a 17-year-old student. Now, according to Ms. Flores' LinkedIn profile, which has since been taken down, she was also a beauty advisor for a cosmetics company, which is just an interesting little detail to say the least. A lot to talk about here. I want to bring back onto the show former prosecutor and civil sexual abuse attorney John Clune. John, thanks so much for coming back on the show. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jesse. Good to see you.
So John, another teacher, a person who holds a position of authority, accused of using that power to take advantage of a teenager. I know these are allegations at this point. Just your overall reaction to seeing this, because it almost feels like it blends in with so much of what we've been hearing recently.
Yeah, I think my reaction is I'm glad to see we're seeing more and more of these cases, and I don't think that the cases are happening any more frequently. I just think there's a lot more reporting that's going on. So, particularly in cases of, the female adult and the male minor, historically, we haven't seen a lot of this reporting. So I'm glad to see it get the attention that it's getting.
Why wasn't there a lot of reporting about it?
I think culturally, we just, we didn't have a real sense of the kind of more predatory nature of, female teachers and, male high school students. I think there's been a lot of sense that, somehow this was some sort of, dream sequence for a 17-year-old boy, or that it's not harmful to a 17-year-old boy. I think we're starting to see that that's wrong. And I think culturally, we're starting to see a shift to understanding that there's real long-lasting harm that comes from these kind of behaviors. And so we're getting more reporting out of it.
You've covered these kinds of cases extensively. What is that harm that you see develop maybe right after the abuse or years down the road?
Yeah, and your question is great, because it can be down the road. Sometimes when you're the teenage boy, it may not be readily apparent, but as those kids, continue to develop, you start to see, particularly in this kind of teacher-student environment, you have significant trust issues with adults. You start to appreciate kind of the predatory nature of what happened. And it also can have a real impact on personal relationships, not just romantic relationships for the 17-year-old boy, but other just interpersonal relationships with adults and coworkers going forward.
Yeah, and I appreciate you mentioning that, because I want to get into the more specific details about this. So according to the Riverbank Sheriff's Office, Ms. Flores is believed to have had sex with a 17-year-old student back in 2023, so 2 years ago. And they say that she has been a teacher at Riverbank High since 2016, which I think is pretty interesting when you think about that time frame. Now, they didn't release many more details about what exactly might have happened or where it happened, like a school, a home, whose home. But John, in their press release, the Stanislaus deputies described the interactions between Flores and this teen as a, quote, relationship. Now, that feels to be a misnomer, right? Because of the power dynamic. How could this actually be a relationship?
Yeah, and that's probably poor phrasing on behalf of the sheriff's office. I don't think they meant any harm by it, but a lot of times when you have a willing participant who's underage, there's a big difference between being a willing participant and consenting to the activity. When you're underage, you can't consent to this activity, but it could look somewhat like a relationship because both parties are willing. It's not some sort of forcible environment. So, it's probably more common than not by a landslide that in these like teacher-student cases, the student is actually engaged, willingly in a fashion that they believe that they're in a relationship at the time. They just legally can't do that with somebody that age.
Why aren't they releasing more details? Now, I will say, at first glance, I understand this is a very, personal matter. You're dealing with a minor, but I've also seen other cases before where Unfortunately, we get a lot more details about what happened. Why are they keeping things close to the vest? Or is it close to the chest? I never know which one. If it's chest or vest, I think people, interpose those, but they mix them up. But anyway, why are they keeping it really, tight-lipped right now?
It may not be that complex of an issue. A lot of times you just see certain sheriff's departments or certain cases, they just decide they're not going to release a lot of information. It's not that they're particularly worried about, a specific fact or two getting out on a case-by-case basis. It could just be the sheriff's office policy. We see that a lot where different police agencies just have different practices about releasing information.
All right, I understand that. Let me tell you what we do know. We know that Ms. Flores was arrested last week at her home. She now faces a charge of unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor. Now, John, first question I had is, typical we see an arrest years later?
I mean, it can be. I mean, it's not uncommon that you have the report and the investigation that happens years later. A lot of times when cases happen, the investigation happens years later, we end up not seeing charges. I mean, it's a little bit, there's a little bit of momentum lost on the part of law enforcement when it's not something that's fresh. But these are serious charges, so I'm not surprised that the investigation happened quickly. And then, an arrest needs to happen in this kind of situation, even though it was years later.
How does a statute of limitations issue work? So in other words, let's say you have a minor victim who didn't come forward for years. Maybe police didn't find out about it years later. Is the statute of limitation paused in a criminal context? Tell me how that works.
It's not. So there are some things that can pause the statute of limitations, but in criminal cases, generally you're operating on what are the number of years from the date of the offense before the case can be charged. In this case, it didn't happen that long ago. And, most states in the country, including California, have extended their statutes of limitations for child sex assault cases for this very reason. It's very common that victims of child sexual abuse don't report in a timely fashion or don't report at all. So most states have extended that. And so they're well within their statute of limitations in this case.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, she was booked at the Stanislaus County Jail on a $20,000 bail bond. It appears that Flores made bail. She's no longer listed as an in-custody inmate in Stanislaus County Jail. Now, $20,000 might seem low. There's been some comments on social media that if this was a male teacher, his bond would have been much higher. John, is that a fair assessment? What do you think about $20,000?
These days it's a relatively high bond. I think that most states are trying to get away from really high bonds because they have historically been applied in a way that people feel are discriminatory. So we're not getting the same, giant bonds that you used to get on cases. Would a male offender get a higher bond? Maybe, but $20,000 is a pretty significant amount of money. Really, the purpose of this is to make sure that this individual is coming to court and doesn't evade, the jurisdiction of the court. So for a local person who has lived there for a number of years, a member of the community, a bond like that seems like it would be sufficient to keep whether it was a male or female teacher coming to court.
And it also matters the charge, right? What the person's facing. So she's charged with unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor. Now, this is according to the Stanislaus Sheriff's Office. So Shaw's California Law Group, we looked this up. They put together a chart which shows the potential punishments under California's penal code. And, correct me if this seems wrong, John, but it says if the defendant is no more than 3 years older than the minor, the misdemeanor offense could result in a year in jail. If the defendant is more than 3 years older than the minor, it could be a misdemeanor, or if charged as a felony, could mean between 16 months and 3 years in jail. And if the defendant is at least 21 and the minor is under 16, it's between 1 and 4 years in jail. So right now it remains unclear if Flores is going to be facing a misdemeanor or a felony charge, and there's no mention in that particular statute about the consequences if the alleged offender is a teacher or is in that position of power. We know the age of consent in California is 18. Sexual intercourse with someone younger than that is expressly illegal. So, John, does the charge make sense to you? Do you sense that this would be a felony or misdemeanor? What do you think?
So the charge makes sense. I would expect this to be a felony. I mean, given the age difference of the two and given the position of trust, as you mentioned, I would expect they'll charge this as a felony. And so she'll be facing up to a few years in prison. She could also be eligible for a county jail sentence. She could also be eligible for straight probation. But given the aggravating nature of the facts, I would expect it to be a felony charge.
How do you prosecute this case? Is it different prosecuting a sexual assault, sexual misconduct case, teacher, student? What evidence do you have to put forward at trial to prove it? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, well, it's really important to know what was the information that was disclosed to the school that made them report this to law enforcement in the first place. Somebody saw something or talked to somebody, and there's some piece of evidence there that made the school feel like this needed to be reported to law enforcement. So quite often we see those are things like text messages, or somebody sees the two of them in public, or maybe at school, sees them in some sort of inappropriate fashion. So that can be really critical evidence. One of the things that I think that a lot of prosecutors try to do these days on cases like this, particularly with a female defendant, is use a sexual assault expert that can explain the dynamics between the two, why it is predatory behavior, explaining why a 17-year-old student wouldn't report it, wouldn't call it sexual assault, those sorts of things. So a jury has a better understanding of some of the facts of the case.
Does this all rely on the alleged victim testifying? If the alleged victim chooses not to testify, and particularly if you're dealing with a case of someone who's much younger than 17 years old, can the prosecutors compel that alleged victim to testify? Because if they don't have that testimony, how do they prove the case?
So they need somebody who is going to testify that there was sexual contact between the two of them. Usually you don't have a third party who's going to say that.
That's hearsay, right? Wouldn't that be hearsay?
Well, no. If somebody saw it, then they could testify to sexual activity.
But let's say they did.
Rare.
Let's say, someone told them.
So either the defendant or the victim statements are going to need to be used to establish that that there was some sort of sexual activity. Quite often in these cases, when they confront the teacher and during the investigation, the teacher admits to at least some or all of the sexual contact. So even if you didn't have the victim testifying, if you have the defendant's statements establishing the sexual contact, that's more than sufficient. I mean, it's basically an admission, right? A confession. So but one of the two of them most likely their statements will need to be used, whether it's, in court in some fashion to be able to establish the charge.
Well, I don't know if she made any statements, Ms. Flores, but let's say she's denying all this. What are your typical defenses that you see? I mean, it can't be, it was consensual, because that's not going to work. This is what we call in the law almost strict liability. If she had sex with a minor or had sexual contact with a minor, that's it. Now, is it just suggesting that this didn't happen, and how would she prove that?
Well, if she was willing to, I mean, she could just say it didn't happen, and she doesn't have to prove that. The prosecution has to prove that it did happen. So that's one defense that's baked in constitutionally, that the prosecution has to carry the burden of proof to convict her. But the other thing that we see sometimes in these cases, they say, look, this maybe have been some fantasy from this young man. He was pursuing me a lot of the time. It was this constant issue. I should have reported it, but I didn't. But he's not telling the truth when he says that this happened. We were probably friendly, and maybe there were some teacher-student, boundaries that were crossed, but there was never anything sexual. That kind of a explanation is something that, defense attorneys want to explore. Is that something that might be viable?
Does it work? Have you seen acquittals based on that?
It certainly can. And again, female defendants can be sympathetic, particularly if they come off well. A lot of times in sexual assault cases, jurors just want you to give them some sort of rationale so that they can feel like this didn't happen. People don't want to believe that this stuff happens on a regular basis. So if you can give them a plausible explanation that doesn't require them to conclude that, a teacher was molesting a student, it's definitely a possibility that they'll go with it, even if it's not the most rational explanation.
John, by the way, I wanted your perspective on something. So some states have what's known as the Romeo and Juliet laws. So it decriminalizes sex between teenagers. So for example, if you have somebody who is 19, they maybe wouldn't face severe consequences for having intercourse with a 16-year-old as long as they were both consenting. According to recordfinders.com, 24 U.S. states have such exceptions, but California isn't one of them. What do you think of those kind of laws? Do you think they should be uniform across the United States? What do you make of it?
I mean, absent any other aggravating circumstance, like, being a teacher, I think that I like the laws that give, some sort of age, like the offender or I should say the actor, the older person has to be a certain number of years older than the younger individual. I do like those laws. We have those in Colorado where I prosecuted, and, it allowed us to, kind of decriminalize behavior that I think even, most parents on both sides of the cases felt like was not criminal behavior.
Yeah. And by the way, going back to Ms. Flores, she wasn't a brand new teacher. I mentioned this before. She'd been at the school for nearly a decade. So the question becomes, John, will police be able to get information from the school district about any other reports of inappropriate behavior? Should we be on the lookout for other people coming forward? I mean, since 2016, it's strange that this is an incident from 2023. It could be the only, this is an allegation, but if it's true, it could be the only perhaps student that was affected by this. But you have to wonder whether or not police are going to be working with the school district to find out as much as they can about Ms. Flores.
Yeah, and the district, they are mandatory reporters, so they should have reported anything that they had heard over the years to law enforcement in the first place. But that's not always a foolproof system. So it could be that there's information that they have about other reports that the school just didn't think rose to the level of calling the sheriff's office, that could be leads that the law enforcement is going to follow up on. The media can be a big trigger for this. So just seeing this in the news, as much as it's been, a lot of times you can get people that come forward and say, yeah, this happened to me as well. But keeping in mind that male victims generally don't report, like this one didn't. Right. So I wouldn't have high expectations of a lot of calls in that regard.
What about whispers and rumors that might have been floating around the school? I say that because a person commented on the sheriff's office Facebook post saying, I had Mrs. Flores as my Spanish teacher from 2016 to 2017. I could say for a fact that it wouldn't surprise me that she would do this kind of thing years later. Hopefully she can learn her lesson from this and get treatment for this behavior she engaged in. Cryptic post, not sure what that actually means, but if rumors were swirling or comments were swirling, how much responsibility is that of the school district, and how does police look into it? How do police look into it?
Yeah, and it depends on how concrete these rumors are. So, every case that I've had that has involved a teacher, there's rumors, and some of them don't amount to anything, and some of them are, I probably wouldn't even classify as rumors. Like there's actual specific, things that people observed, and they're being classified as rumors. So, depending on how concrete they are, they can be significant for law enforcement and potential liability for the school. Law enforcement can certainly, they're going to be interested. They're going to be interested to know, anything that they hear from, whether it's the school or other students or that sort of thing about these rumors, to know, are there any victims that are out there that they're going to follow up with?
By the way, talking about the school, in response to the allegations against Flores, Riverbank Unified School District Superintendent Constantino Aguilar said in the release, it is truly unfortunate for our district to face a situation like this. While we continue to work with law enforcement, the district will also look to determine what options it may have available to independently address this matter. And John, by the way, this isn't the first time something like this has allegedly happened at this same school. December 2023, former basketball coach Logan Neighbors was accused of having sex with a 16-year-old several years earlier. He was 23 at the time. The accusations came to light when the alleged victim talked about their experiences on social media. And Neighbors faces charges related to unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor and oral copulation, turned himself in, made $75,000 bail. He was released. The school district said that Neighbors was a basketball coach at Riverbank High, but wasn't a teacher. According to the Stanislaus Superior Court, his case still ongoing. John, so now talk to me, what does that mean the school is going to do an independent investigation? And also, what responsibility does the school have here?
Yeah, well, I mean, now that you have a second offense in a number of years,
alleged
by a teacher,
offense. Yeah,
or a second report, sure. They've got an issue that they need to look into. I mean, they're trying to manage not having a panic on the part of the parents of that district. But, 2 different allegations in a relatively short period of time should give the board some concern that maybe something's being missed at the day-to-day school level. So this investigation could be to try to figure out, like, what do we need to be doing better as a school? It could be kind of a civil defense investigation where they want to figure out, how do we defend ourselves if we get sued by one or both of these students or other students. It's hard to know when there's an investigation. It can be a good investigation, or it could be kind of a whitewash investigation, and we won't know until it's done which of those it is.
John, let me finish with this. Assuming these allegations are true, and look, they're entitled to their defense, they're innocent until proven guilty, but assuming these allegations are true, and maybe just big picture, why do we see these things happen? You've covered these cases. Why do the defendants, do they ever admit why they did it? Is there an underlying pattern about why this happens?
There are different patterns, and I don't know. I'm less of an expert in offender dynamics, but they generally don't admit during the case why it happened, or they don't have anything insightful to say while it happened. It usually takes several years of therapy before they get a sense of unpacking, what it is, usually in their own childhood, that has led them to the point where they're attracted to people that are not old enough to consent to sexual activity. So it's a complicated issue. It takes, like I said, usually years of therapy to get a sense of why this happens.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand it, but maybe it's kind of impossible to understand. John Clune, thanks so much for taking the time. Really appreciate your perspective, and a lot that we had to cover. Thank you so much.
Right. Thanks, Jesse.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.